Welcome to 5 Minutes a Day. If you're just stopping by, we are a tool of, it's at least 5 minutes a day, right? So the best way to use this tool is to read the passage, to listen to the video, because I've done the work. I've read through the commentaries and I've looked at scripture. I looked at the original writings and lots of texts. And so I've done the work for us. So then you can listen to the video and maybe gain insight on this text that you hadn't seen before. And then spend some time in reflection and responding how God would like you to respond to this text. And spend some time praying. So just go deeper. So go ahead and like, because that brings other people to see our videos, and subscribe. Hello and good morning, and welcome to Monday, a new week, and welcome to 5 Minutes a Day with God. So if you're just joining us, this is a tool, and we are going through the Old Testament, and we've been going through Genesis, because frankly, unless you grew up in church and you went to Sunday school, lots of times in churches they tend to preach from the New Testament, or even youth group, it's about topics. And so it's important for us to know the whole scripture, because scripture shows us who God is, and it brings out his character, and it shows truths that we can still respond to today. So we have been going through the exciting saga of Joseph, and today is kind of like the climax of the story. So Joseph was sold into Egypt as a slave, and he rose into a power of influence in Potiphar's house, and then he was wrongly accused, and he's got thrown in prison, and then he gets left there. He interprets dreams for the butler and the baker, but the butler kind of goes on his way and forgets about him, and then finally 2 years later Pharaoh has a dream, but the butler remembers him, and Joseph comes out and interprets the dream and is able to save not only Egypt but the surrounding areas because of the famine, and they were able to prepare for the famine. And so when the famine came, there was food in the land, and so countries are surrounding came into Egypt as well to gather food. So Joseph's brothers came to Egypt out of the need that they had, and he's been having all these different interactions. And so finally here is in Genesis 45, read it on your own, he reveals himself that I am Joseph, your brother, that you sold into slavery. Now can you imagine the shock? Can you imagine all the feelings that are encompassing these brothers, right? So guilt and shame and probably horror, right? Here's a man of influence. Here's a man of power that can basically end their lives. And so there's shock, dismay, and maybe a little joy in there, thinking, wow, our brother didn't die, he's alive and he's well. And so what happens here is he asks Joseph, when he reveals himself to him, he says, is my father still alive? And they're so shocked that they can't even answer him, because they're like, oh no, we're gonna die, right? And so the word here, dismayed, in Hebrew it's bahal, and it means frightened, amazed, or even terrified. So they were basically like the idiom we would use would be shaking in their boots, right? Worrying about their lives. But then Joseph, this is a beautiful testimony, I want you to read it, goes into this testimony and said, and this is one of my favorite phrases in the Bible, definitely in the story. It says, so now it was not you who sent me here, but God. So he says there was a purpose. There's a purpose that God had. So despite their sin of selling him, that God had a purpose. And it's just recently when I started studying this story, this passage, that there's actually two purposes that I didn't even think of. One of them, again, is God sent him to save not only Egypt, but Canaan and the surrounding nations around him. if they weren't prepared for the famine, after 7 years of famine, lots of people would have died. And so God used Joseph to save, literally so many people, thousands and maybe even millions of people. But the other thing is there was a purpose that Joseph's family is going to end up staying in Egypt. And even though in the story of Exodus, we are saddened and horrified that they're slaves for 400 years, but it's also part of God's purpose. Because if they had stayed in Canaan, this group of 70 people would have assimilated. They would have had to assimilate some way and they would have been, they would have lost their calling as a nation set apart to worship God. They would have assimilated and followed the gods of the land. But because Egyptian was a segregated people, they wouldn't mix. They wouldn't intermarry with these Israelites. So they were free to just grow as a nation into a nation of millions from 70. So God knew what he was doing in allowing them to settle into Egypt and to be this nation that after 3 million will be ready to go back into Canaan. And so then he sends them home, and can you imagine Jacob rejoices that his son, after all these years, after 20 years, that he thought was dead, is now alive. So we're going to continue this story, but this beautiful climax of Joseph revealing himself, showing no bitterness, showing forgiveness to his brothers who basically wanted him dead, and also seeing the fulfillment of God's promises in his vision about Joseph reigning over his brothers. So think about that and see how God would want you to respond. Maybe there's some forgiveness that you need to be dealing with as well, and just reminding that God has a purpose for your life, even in the ups and downs, and we may not see it. Have a good day and see you tomorrow. Remember, 5 minutes in the Word can change your life.